Perfect. Welcome everyone to this 32nd edition of the Roundtable series. I'm very excited about this one. I mean, I've been very happy with the presentations over the last 7, 8 months of the year. But the topic that we're going to be discussing today is one that I don't normally come across, and I'm sure it's the same, not be for you, concerning subnational measurements of corruption, right? And there's a lot that we can talk about that, and of course we will. So before I introduce the speakers today, and well, invite them to the floor so I can introduce themselves, and it's mostly Lamar, and his co-author Jeroen is also here with us. Although I know Lamar is going to be taking the lead. Just a couple of things about how the roundtable will progress today, and this is the usual things. So we'll have 90 minutes in total. The presentations, so we're not going to have the Q&A for the end. So if you at any moment have any questions or comments, please don't be shy. Feel free to interrupt by clicking the hand icon or just physically raising your hand, and I will invite you to unmute yourself. And that way we can have a little discussion about whatever Lamar is discussing at that moment. Other than that, any other moment, I'll ask you to please make sure that you're muted. And if for any reason you have to leave the room and come back, make sure that you remain muted when you come back, because often not, yeah, the mic is open and that interrupts the presentation. Also, at least the first time that you participate, again, either with a question or comment, if you could very briefly introduce yourself, your name, your affiliation, and any other sort of information that you would like to share with the rest of us. Because the idea has always been from the beginning to have a little bit of a community here. The majority, I mean, all of us here are involved professionally in one way or another with the control of corruption. And many of us dedicate a significant amount of time specifically to discussion of measurement of corruption. So it's a good opportunity also to connect, right? Yes, so that's it from my side. So I will invite Lamar and perhaps Jeroen to I mean the floor is yours now. So please, if you could start introducing yourself, and feel free to start sharing your screen whenever you're ready.
Yeah, good, great, thanks. I'll quickly set up the screen. And then, oh, okay. Does this work?
Yes, perfect, full screen.
Great. And then good, all right. That's out of the way. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, just to say it again. I'm very happy to have been invited here to introduce our subnational corruption database. We published it recently in Scientific Data, and we went through the hellish task to try and make two separate corruption indices for 1,473 subnational areas in 178 countries, also over time. So I've co-authored this data descriptor together with Professor Jeroen Smits, who he himself is an expert on subnational development and indicator building. He's the founder of the Global Data Lab, which perhaps you also find interesting. It's a place where you can download over 100 subnational indicators, all in a consistent regional classification. I don't want to waste too much time on myself. Let me begin with what I am not, and that is an anti-corruption expert. Okay, so if you are going through this talk and you think, what nonsense is this guy saying, please let us know, and then perhaps we can somehow account for this in a future version of this database. What I am is an economist. I'm a PhD candidate at ETH Zurich, recently defended. I focus on political economy and development economics. So naturally, corruption became an interesting topic for me. However, what I noticed is that economists are worming themselves in many silly directions to be able to try and find some causal effect of corruption. And we would like to introduce here the subnational dimension to it to perhaps make that easier from the economics perspective. Yeah, so without further ado, I will quickly introduce the topic. Why did we think there is a need for a subnational corruption index? And some potential applications. Again, sorry, unfortunately, from an economics perspective mostly. And we've also spent time recently on developing an animated explainer video with the two of us, where our goal is to bring this database, or at least make it more accessible also for a more general audience or for policymakers in general. And you, as a group, have the honor to be the first to see this video, and we're very curious to know what you think. Um, then after the, say, simple version, we will head to a more technical area, and I will go through the methodology of the subnational corruption database. Which sources did we use? Which tricks, if you will, did we apply in order to make things more comparable and more consistent? And then I'll quickly go through a descriptive overview. And finally, in, say, like a small workshop style, I'll show you how you can access the data in the different ways that might be better or worse for you. So just to quickly introduce, from the economics perspective, the corruption literature is suffering from several issues. In the comparative field, we are looking at corruption using broad indices, such as the World Bank's Control of Corruption Index or Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. However, we know that corruption can take many forms, and that these forms can have many different implications. Now, additionally, these indices are generally perceptions-based, and these perceptions are often from experts. So the Corruption Perceptions Index is an expert-based index. The World Bank Control of Corruption Index is a mix of households and experts. Then we also know that many outcome variables that we are interested in, such as economic growth, are determined by corruption, but corruption has those same determinants. Think about culture, institutions, other institutions, or perhaps country-level macroeconomic shocks or international macroeconomic shocks. All of these factors could influence, say, both economic growth and corruption. And what economists, at least, have often done is to try and exploit longitudinal variation, that is, changes over time, to try and find at least some causal assessment of corruption on economic growth or other interesting outcome variables. However, this is often disappointing because these indices are quite stagnant. They're inert. They don't change much over time. And at the same time, it is not clear why the indices are changing over time. Is that, for instance, because people think differently of grant corruption, or because they have experienced more bribery or so? You don't know. So, given these issues, we thought, okay, let's create a corruption database that adds two things. First, separate corruption into perceptions of grant corruption, that is theft at the central level, and experiences with petty corruption, so bribery from different areas. And let's not only separate this concept of corruption, but at the same time, let's also try and measure this at the subnational level in a consistent way over time. That is essentially what the subnational corruption database does. It offers you two corruption indices, grant and petty, and allows you to assess this subnationally over time. So, there's many applications for this. Again, from the economic growth perspective, economists always like to think of funny things. And one of them is that corruption sometimes could actually increase economic growth. Well, this, for instance, happens in very specific situations. We call it the greasing the wheels hypothesis. And so you could imagine that in countries with very inefficient bureaucracies, and then especially in rural areas that are far from the central institutions, there the government might be so weak that essentially it would be beneficial for a local economy to circumvent the government and allow for some bribery in order to maximize output. You could also think of using corruption as a key moderator. Yeah, you could look at the effectiveness of development assistance and see whether this depends on the effectiveness of local institutions. Or perhaps you are more interested from an institutional perspective, and you would like to see how petty and grant corruption intertwine in different contexts, how national and subnational institutions are related to each other, or simply as a key control, because as it stands, this database is the only one that allows you to control for subnational institutions in what we argue is a consistent manner. So having said that, now I got to this animated explainer video. We've tried our best, but as you know, economists are not the most creative. So if you see any issues, please let me know. And if you can hear the sound, it would be good if you could confirm that as well. So maybe someone can do a thumbs up. Okay. Thank you very much. Can you? No sound? Okay. Then I quickly have to reshare it like this.
Introduction video of Corruption Radar's subnational corruption database. The subnational corruption database, or SCD, presents indicators allowing you to assess corruption in 1,473 subnational areas, like states or provinces, in 178 countries. The data underlying the SCD mainly come from external household surveys, which Corruption Radar has harmonized and standardized. The main indicator of the SCD is the Subnational Corruption Index, or SCI. The SCI scores subnational areas on their relative corruption between 0, most corrupt, and 100, least corrupt. The SCI is a simple average of the grand corruption perceptions and petty corruption experiences indices, which have both been developed independently. Grand corruption, defined as the abuse of high-level power that benefits the few at the expense of the many, is captured by 11 dimensions, including perceived corruption in the judicial branch, in taxation, in the police authorities, or in politicians. Petty corruption, defined as the everyday abuse of entrusted power by public officials, is captured by 8 dimensions, including experienced corruption in healthcare, in education, or in gaining access to basic utilities. Different surveys sometimes ask questions slightly differently, which can impact how people respond. To minimize such noise, we adjust the results using data from countries where multiple surveys are available during the same time period. In case corruption dimensions are missing for an individual, we use imputation methods to fill all missing values. This is important because respondents do not perceive and experience corruption equally across dimensions. For instance, politicians are generally perceived as much more corrupt than the police authorities. Without imputation, there would be no way of telling if differences in the SCI are due to actual changes, or rather, due to the capturing of different dimensions in different countries and years. Finally, we reduce the effect of outliers caused by small sample sizes by limiting the variation of subnational areas relative to their country and their own historical data. Our subnational data are available in 3 forms. The baseline data, which can be split in petty and grand corruption, are available for all years in which the underlying surveys are available. The comprehensive data use methods of interpolation and extrapolation using trends of external indices to arrive at a full series for each subnational area. Finally, we offer subnational estimates of 2 established corruption indices, the World Bank's Control of Corruption Index and Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, based on the SCI. The SCD has also been integrated into the Global Data Lab, allowing you to easily combine our corruption data with over 100 other subnational indicators, such as material well-being, human capital, or CO2 emissions. Visit corruptionradar.org for the latest version of the SCD, detailed information on new corruption research, or to subscribe to our newsletter. More details on the SCI's construction procedures are available in our Nature Scientific Data article. Finally, feel free to reach out using contact@corruptionradar.org.
All right, so that's the video.
Welcome to
There we go. Okay, so let's do this again, but in a much more boring way. What I would like
very impressive.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So what I will do is to reverse engineer the index. Yeah, we start from a happy place and we're going to make things trickier and trickier. So what you envision is a global survey asked to enough people in each country every year with exactly the same questions in the same way. Yeah, so what we have done here is we developed a grant and petty corruption index separately, the grant corruption index based on 11 dimensions and the petty corruption index based on 8 dimensions. And the idea here is that you, if you will, you should envision a data set of about 1.3 million individuals that all have information on every single dimension. This is the point where we are at now. And on this data, we have applied principal components analysis in order to two of them in order to create a grant corruption index and a petty corruption index. I'm saying it a lot because it is valuable to know that you can analyze these indices effect on one another or look at them separately. Yeah, they are not imputed with each other. Together, in a simple average approach, they create the subnational corruption index. And so each of these indices ranges from 0, which is the area that is the most corrupt in the 95 to 22 time period, and 100, which is the least corrupt in that time period. Yeah, so you can also compare changes over time. Now, unfortunately, not all of these 19 dimensions are available in every survey or for every individual. It could be that somebody didn't answer a question on a specific corruption type, or simply it wasn't available in the survey because, well, everyone has limits in resources and such. So what we have to do is we have to make sure that these values are filled in. Because if we don't do so, then it could be the case that changes in these corruption indices are not caused by actual differences over time, but rather because we are focusing on different dimensions. Yeah, we're kind of putting the spotlight on different aspects, and we know that people think differently about different dimensions. So what it said in the video is people generally are very negative about politicians, but much less so about police officers. Yeah? If in one year we would look at police officers and in the other year at politicians, we would have a huge change that is actually not an actual change, but because we're looking at different dimensions. Joseph, you have a question or comment?
Yes, I'm sorry. I was wondering if I could interrupt you. I had a question about your previous slide. And I'm sure that some of these points you may address later in your presentation, so please let me know so and you know that way I know what to expect. But just so that we are all on the same page about what we're seeing here specifically. So we have percentages going from each one of these dimensions to the component, right? For example, in terms of grant corruption, we see executive 9.9%. So I assume that aggregates to 100% of these components.
I hope
right?
so. Yes.
Okay, so the same for petty corruption. Now you mentioned principal component analysis, so that means then that you're extracting or you're creating a variable from these underlying dimensions, correct?
That's right. Yeah.
Could you explain very briefly this point about the percentages? And the reason I ask this is because in other approaches to corruption metrics, where we also see, not also, but we see the use of statistical weights applied, taking into consideration the importance of different components,
You
correct?
come up from where was it again?
Sorry about that. Okay. So, for what I understand, this is not what's happening here, right? So could you just walk us through this process? And again, if this is something that you were going to tackle later, then that's perfectly fine.
No, actually not. So that's good. Yeah, so these percentages are the result of a principal components analysis. So you bunch together all the dimensions. So for the grant corruption case, it would be 11. And then this algorithmic approach will give you the percentages. The more unique a dimension is in terms of values for individuals, the more weight it gets. So if two dimensions are very similar, or if there's not a lot of variation, then it will be punished to the extent that it actually determines this latent variable, this invisible variable in the air that we are trying to make and that we then later on call grant corruption. So what the algorithm does is it will give you several indices in which it tries to maximize the variation. And then we always opt to take the first one, the one that captures the most of the total variation in all dimensions. Yeah, this is where these percentages come from. So there's no value weight assigned to it. It is not that we think that corruption in the legislative is more important than corruption in the police authorities. It's simply that apparently people have more diverse opinions on the legislative, and as a result, this method will make this dimension more important as a determinant. Does that make it clear enough?
Absolutely, at least for me. Thank you. And as you mentioned, after this, so of course you're also will see in here the alpha, which is the
Conceptual consistency.
right. So those are pretty high. The labeling for these components is produced based on the interpretation of the dimension that are being clustered together, correct?
Yeah, so the names of the indices are given to the principal components that result from the method. We also tried with factor analysis, by the way, it's almost the same. The names of the dimensions are from us. Yeah, we have been staring at these surveys. We at some point realized, okay, certain questions are asked a lot, others not, and they kind of fit in this category. And we'll get back to why we needed these dimensions in the first place later on.
Great, thank you. And there's definitely going to be a number of questions because a bunch of us are really nerdy when it comes to, understanding the raw data. So where this information come from. But just so that, because for most of these dimensions, again, the majority of us will be very familiar with what they mean, and we can already have some idea of the sort of equation that were involved. The only one that doesn't really match that profile is that of severity here.
Yeah.
Could you explain that
And
one?
you see it also has quite a low weight. So
Right.
the older surveys are much more general. Yeah. The older surveys, say the 90s or early 2000s, the questions on corruption were very limited. And essentially they ask simply how severe you think corruption is in the country. And yeah, so and this is what this dimension captures. And other than that, there is no it is, I would say, maybe a mix of the different dimensions, but it allows us to somehow connect more historical data with more modern data for those surveys where you kind of see this transition where they start asking things more specifically.
Thank you. And I'll hand you over also to Joanna because she has a question.
Yeah, I
But
see.
before doing that, I just wanted to say a line about that. And this is quite interesting because indeed those questions were very prominent, especially from the idea that, corruption is just the one thing. Later we learned to ask more specific questions. But it is important to continue highlighting for everyone that the reason why severity is integrated into grand corruption instead of petty corruption, even though the wording of the question did not necessarily explicitly confirm that aspect, is because this is the result of the PCA analysis. So it wasn't as a subjective individual researcher decision, correct?
Whether severity is put at grand or petty?
Correct.
No, this is a subjective decision. It is not a result of the method. No. We simply saw the question and decided subjectively, hey, this is more likely to measure grand corruption than it is to have to do with actual experiences on the ground.
Okay, so I have a question about that, but I'm sure Joanna can ask it better than I can. So Joanna, please go ahead.
Okay, yes. Yeah, my question was very similar and in the same line that the previous one. It's about, yeah, so just for understand, you use different questions and you classify between grand corruption and petty corruption, right?
That's right, yeah,
Based on
within the
different-
dimensions.
But grand corruption is more related to perceptions, sorry, and petty corruption is more related to experiences of corruption, right? Like
Exactly.
you ask for a prize and things. So you use different resources because just thinking the different resources. Yeah, there are different resources for each of these questions, but basically you use a public opinion service for all, or you use maybe aggregated index for the grand corruption. No, you use for all.
We always
public
use these public opinion surveys, almost always. Yeah, I will go through the sources also later on.
Oh, okay, perfect. Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Lamar. Please go ahead.
Yeah, you sure you don't want to talk about the severity thingy?
No, I'm sure I'm gonna get back to this one, but please continue.
Okay, good. All right, good. So we have established principal components. Weights are higher if there is more variation within that dimension. And these two have been built separately. Dimensions have been made subjectively and assigned subjectively to grand embedding. And these two are completely independent from each other. So here we are, but some dimensions are missing for each individual. Okay, so let's imagine an individual that has answered a survey. We're looking at petty corruption specifically for now, and the first 5 dimensions, government officials, authorities, documents, they are available. However, we are dealing with a survey where health, elections, and education is missing, or alternatively, it doesn't exist, but all dimensions are available, and this person just simply decided not to answer about health, elections, and education. Now, again, to avoid the problem that variation in our subnational corruption index is a result of changes in dimensions, we have to somehow impute these values so that we can always compare everyone, so every individual, every subnational area, every country, on a level playing field where we somehow account for the different ways in which people perceive these different types of corruptions or experience these different types of corruptions. Giovanna?
Yes, what do you mean with health, elections, and education? Because I remember there are some information about elections, for example, vote buying, but I don't know what do you mean with health and education and with
Yeah, so these are the dimensions from this
okay.
picture. Yeah. So I focus.
Okay. No, from the data.
I tried to make it fancy. So this is blue, and this is still blue, and so we're focusing on petty corruption, and the health and education in the bottom, and the next to it elections. They're missing for a certain individual, and we're trying to fill in the missing values for these 3 dimensions.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Now, good. So what we do is we use an imputation technique using chained regression. So how this works is what you do is you take the first 5 dimensions that you do have, and you create a regression model to explain the healthcare dimension. Say, yeah, so this healthcare dimension is like questions on, hey, did you have to pay a bribe to a doctor, to a nurse when you were sick? All these questions are like bunched together in health. We have to keep it simple. And what you do then is in this chained approach is now we have a predicted value for health and we have actual values for the first 5 dimensions. We now use the predicted value of health and the other 5 to explain education. We have a regression model with the first 5 and health to explain education. And then now we have health and education fields and we explain elections. Yeah, and that then decides the first step of a cycle, say. And you will keep doing the cycle, and then you start with education or you start with elections, and then you finish a first iteration where you have changed through each of the steps to get an imputed value for each of them. What you are doing is essentially like a spider web. You are looking at the interrelation of all these dimensions from all different barometers with different ways of questioning. Yeah, and you use these correlational patterns to fill up some value, to fill in some value for these missing dimensions. Yeah, and what we do is we iterate through this 10 times so that these estimates, these imputed values become somewhat stable so that it doesn't change all over the place. So essentially the takeaway from this is that we use the relationship between dimensions from all these barometers from different institutions and organizations and use these links to fill in missing values. And this is kind of what that looks like. So I grabbed the table from the paper. Here you clearly see that, so for grant corruption for politicians, which is the 4th from the bottom on the left, you see that the value is 0.378 on average in the sample, yeah? Whereas for the authorities, that is the police, in the very bottom, you see 0.590, which means that politicians are perceived as more corrupt. Yeah, lower is more corrupt always. I don't like it, but that's in line with how it's done. than the police authorities. Okay, and this is exactly the reason why we need to do this, because else these changes become unclear why it happens. Then in the column for N, you see for how many individuals we actually have this dimension. And in survey N, you see the percentage of the total for which that is the case. Yeah, so we have imputed quite a lot, not because we are going to claim, hey, we know exactly what is corruption in the healthcare sector for this subnational area. No, we don't release that information. Rather, so that we can compare everyone in a level playing field and not have these random shocks depending on which type of corruption that you are looking at. Okay? We want to keep things conceptually consistent over time and between areas. Good. So we have looked at what dimensions we use. We have looked at the imputation process to ensure that every individual has a value for all of the 19 dimensions. But where the heck do these dimensions come from? Okay, so let's focus on the elections dimension, which was one of the trickier ones. And this elections dimension is essentially a bunch of questions that have been thrown together by us, where we think, okay, this kind of all relates to elections. And what you see is that, for instance, in the Afrobarometers in 2012, they ask, hey, during the last election, how often, if ever, did someone from a political party offer you something? And what we see for the World Values Survey, which is the second from the bottom, they ask about how often this happens in general. Okay, so this could be based also on experience of your family or your friends. Clearly, it is much more likely that you or your family or your friend or someone you know has been bribed than that it is that only you were bribed, clearly. So we have to adjust for this somehow. And there are many such individual cases. For instance, if you ask people how corrupt something is, they will be much more extreme than if you ask them how many people working there are corrupt. So for instance, if you ask how corrupt is the police, are the police authorities, then generally people answer that this is much more corrupt than if you ask how many police officers are corrupt or how many people in the police force are corrupt. Because, hey, say my cousin is working for the police, so not everyone is corrupt, right? That is the extreme case there. But that same person might have said that it is extremely corrupt, but not my cousin or my brother or something like that, right? So what we do is, for each individual issue that we have seen, like a conceptual discrepancy between questions, a semantic difference, if you will, that we think has an influence on the results, we looked for a set of countries that is available in both types of surveys. And assuming that these questions belong to the same dimension, assuming that they are measuring the same kind of corruption of elections, we would not expect any difference at the country level, say, in the outcome of these questions of representative samples of these countries in different sources. That's the trick. When we do see that, that's when we start making adjustments. So for instance, in the questions that we are focused on, you have the Afrobarometers question and the World Values Survey question. And in that sense, the World Values Survey is very important because it allows us, via the World Values Survey, to connect many different sources, because it has a global sample. So in this case, we know that Egypt, Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa, and Zimbabwe, they have answered an election question in roughly the same time period. However, there are differences in how these questions have been answered. So what we do is we try to minimize the number of changes that we make. And in this case, that meant that we adjust the Afrobarometers to the World Values Survey. So what we do is we look at, hey, what's the difference in the average answer for these countries between the two surveys? And then we push up the entire Afrobarometers, so also all other countries. And we also make sure that the standard deviations, the difference in standard deviations is also applied. So what you get is that the Afrobarometers are shifted into the same distribution as that for the World Values Survey, based on the differences that we observe for this set of overlap countries, if you will. Yeah. Based on these countries, we shift the entire Afrobarometers to the same level as the World Value Survey, such that changes to the subnational corruption index are not dependent on how questions are asked, yeah? Or at least, let's not say not, but rather we have minimized that potential issue. And we have found that this is extremely important. Things can be very, very different depending on how you ask things. And in terms of validation, which we will also do later, if you compare our index to the World Bank and Transparency International indices, this helped tremendously to make sure that these questions were consistent, that they were made comparable.
Lamar, if I may interrupt, just to confirm this. So the reason for pushing the scores of the Afrobarometer closer to that of the World Value Survey is because of the way that the question of each one of these surveys was constructed, right? The fact that the Afrobarometer one is more restrictive, the World Value Survey is more general. So the expectation is that the more general one would be closer to reality. So we push up the Afrobarometer results, correct?
Yeah, exactly. So say in 1 year you're asking people whether they were bribed, and another you're asking the same country on hey, whether somebody they know was bribed or if they heard about it. Well, then it's unfair that then corruption seems to increase by a lot in such a short time period, right? That's kind of the idea behind it. Of course, we did it the other way around. Yeah, we built an index and we saw it flying all over the place, and we're like, where the hell is this coming from? And then we slowly realized, oh, these questions are so substantially different that people are answering them differently depending on how they are asked. Yeah, and so with this example, it is very clear because you are asking about a larger share of the population on whether you think that they are being paid bribes. But in other cases, it is not so clear. For instance, I never expected that there could be so there's about a 20 percentage point difference, 20 percentage points. Yeah. So if you ask about the number of people and how corrupt things are, for me, that was quite surprising.
Thank you.
Yeah,
this is really excellent. It's very insightful, and at the same time, it connects with other discussion that we've had both here in the roundtable and in general about the impact of different wording or framing of the question and how that may impact our capacity to measure the underlying actual phenomenon. So this is really great. Thank you.
Wow, that's good to know. Yeah. So we've tried to solve it in this way. Clearly, it's not going to be perfect, but it has led to a lot of changes that we believe make things much more consistent. Good. So this is where the dimensions come from. Yeah?
I would like to add a little comment here about the culture. Because in Eastern societies with very big social connections in families and in society, when you are asked the same question in maybe Germany, Berlin, or in Cairo, do you know someone who have paid bribery? Maybe the Germans are not very open to talk about it. But in Egypt, everyone know everything. They will always have these stories. So there is a very big difference in the result between have you been affected directly by the bribery or have you heard that not just by the quantity, but also by the cultural aspects. Thanks.
Yeah. That's a good point to make, especially for this dimension that culturally people might answer things differently, and so if I extrapolate from that, it could indeed be that these changes based on these countries might not be appropriate for the other countries. This is true. Yeah, this is a weakness of the data.
Just as a comment there, and I know that this is now outside of this particular presentation, but it does make me wonder about the gap between the two questions or the results of the two questions across countries to see, because what is saying that in fact we should potentially then expect smaller or narrower gaps in countries such as Germany, because the type of bribery or issues related to corruption that people would be aware of are the ones that they have experienced themselves, and they wouldn't have heard from their neighbors and acquaintances, whereas in other countries such as Egypt, that would have been the case. So I wonder if there are some patterns in the distribution of gaps as well. Again, an idea for further exploration.
Yeah, it's definitely true. Though I think to some extent it assumes the luxury that we might not have, because these gaps, to be able to look at these gaps, that's already quite tricky. So this example, there's many countries. It could be that in some other cases you're doing this based on only 2 countries or so. So to have a proper comparison of how people answer these things, that's going to be tricky. If you want to do something like that, I think you're going to have to also focus on a broader concept. So rather focus on semantics in different questions, say also about trust and whatnot, where you can try to maximize the degree of this overlap. Yeah? But for corruption, just from having gone through everything, I don't see it happening. Okay, so this is where dimensions come from. They are not born out of nothing. Instead, they come from different questions that we decided are similar enough. And if we see that they are not similar enough, then we make this adjustment. So then,
sorry, one question,
yeah.
Another question regarding this. These are harmonization with the different sources. So you try to use very similar questions for dimensions. If not, you try to harmonize them, right? But
Right.
you have like protocols to see, because if I understood correctly, you say that uh, you choose one survey to try to fit the another survey, right? To try to yeah to make they very similar. So you have any protocols to decide what survey is gonna fit the another survey, or you just decide very subjectively? I don't know.
For fun. No. So what we do is, um, so this is very hands-on manual. Yeah. So you have a set of questions, and you've decided that they fit to a certain dimension, and you look at the set of questions, and hopefully you will see that there's a set of sources that kind of asks things similarly. And then you have 1 or 2 cases where things are very different. And essentially, the approach we took is to minimize the amount of changes that we have to make. So it's not that, because in the end, these dimensions are thrown together in a principal components analysis, that they don't have to measure conceptually exactly the same thing, as long as we can compare countries properly within individuals, countries, areas properly within the dimension. That is the necessity. So it could be that for one dimension we focus on how many people are corrupt, while for the other dimension we focus on how extreme corruption actually is, simply if that minimizes the amount of changes we have to make, or just based out of pure necessity, because what if there is no proper link? What if there is no set of overlap countries that goes in a general direction? Like we don't have the luxury to be consistent between dimensions in the way that we measure things. Luckily, that's not necessary. Yeah. Clear. Okay. Good. And then within the dimension, we, of course, have different questions. So just quickly how that looks. We have managed to combine about 800 surveys, and this is mostly individuals. Yeah. So these are your general barometers, Afrobarometers, Eurobarometers, social surveys. Yeah. And if there is a country that does not have information in any of these 11 sources ever, then we resort to the World Bank Enterprise Surveys. If even that is not available, we resort to World Bank Country Opinion Surveys. And these are very, very small and expert-based. We do this for 1.66% of the area years. And the idea here is that we want to have as full as possible a picture of corruption. But in future updates, if say a country becomes available in one of the other sources, or hey, some other source that is similar, then we will take out these enterprise and country opinion based results. So these are only there to be able to have some kind of full picture, no matter how bad it is. in the data, it is clearly indicated where the information comes from, yeah? Whether it's the Americas Barometer, whether it's the World Value Survey, perhaps a mix of the two. So whoever uses whatever, they can choose which values they would like to keep and which not. So then, for example, if you want to have an example of a value for the petty corruption healthcare dimension, then for the Federal District of Brazil in 2010, it would be 0.944. Why? Because of the whole sample where they asked, did you ever pay a bribe to use public health services? In the Federal District, 94.4% of the respondents said no. So that is then the value that they get for that dimension. That's the real raw data point. Then finally, we saw that indeed, the smaller the sample on which the value for the subnational area is based, the more extreme the values are. That makes sense. So what you see here in these graphs is the relationship between the residuals. So how different are you as a subnational area compared to other regions in your country in a given year? How much of a crazy value are you compared to your neighbors? In the top, for both grant corruption on the left and petty corruption on the right. At the same time, you see this relationship in the bottom. Hey, how different are you as a subnational area compared to your other values in the past? Where you might have had more data, more respondents. Yeah. What we saw after a sensitivity analysis and such, that if you limit this maximum difference between areas within a country or between values over time of a given area, that if you set this limit to about 0.55 and minus 0.55, you will capture most observations when the number of respondents is large. So based on this general pattern, we decided, okay, even for small sample sizes, we will keep you in. We believe the direction in which corruption is changing or in which you are more corrupt than other areas in your country. However, we don't believe the extremity of it. Yeah. So we limit this maximum difference or this maximum change to the 0.55 value. And we do that for everyone and everything. Yeah, so this is how we make things a bit more stable, hopefully over time.
Lamar, can I ask a question about that number, 0.55? Both about how you get to that number and the decision to apply the same number across the sample. So for all countries.
Yeah. So if you see here, like, so these black lines are the 55 lines, and you see that indeed things are more extreme. Yeah. So either you are much less corrupt or much more corrupt compared to other regions in your country. That's how you read this. However, once the sample size increases by enough, you'll see that most observations lie within this bandwidth. And so then we have somehow interpreted this as the true maximum difference in corruption. Yeah? So if in larger areas, if we see this pattern, then probably this is also what is happening in the areas with fewer observations. And we have applied that assumption to all areas. Yeah? And we have done it for everything simply because we see it across the different comparisons. Yeah, we see it except for instance, this point here, we see that mostly everything lies in the 55 range, and as well here. We have run, I think, 50 different analyses. So you got 50 different indices where you each time increase it by 0.01 or decrease it by 0.01. And all of those are also quite similar. You simply want to avoid that you give too much value to these extremes, which are clearly a result of just simply having a low number of observations.
Yes, no, it sounds very reasonable, and I think that it was the right choice. My question was a little more in the sense that what what we've seen in other projects that take a similar approach, or at least are trying also to resolve or deal with the issue of outliers, is to basically frame it in terms of standard deviations, with the possibility of doing that for every country. So every country, their data would be explored, and then the exact cutting point would be based on the standard deviations. So could you say something about how you decided to go in this direction, and specifically the application of that cutting point across the board instead of just adjusting it for every specific country?
I actually think it's quite similar. The standard deviation specific to the country is also a given value, yeah. And so what you see here are residuals, but these residuals are specific to they are a result of a model that includes country year dummies. As a result, these residuals are also country year specific. Yeah? So even though the 55 value is applied across the board, this 55 value means different things for different countries. Yeah?
Okay, thank you. I think that clarifies it. Yep.
Okay, good. So this is how we then have diminished the effect of small sample sizes. And essentially that is how we have constructed this database. Now, how does that look? This is a map of subnational grant corruption perceptions. And for each area, you see the latest value available. So this is real data, no tricky extrapolation or so. So we could be comparing countries in different years and such, but this is the most recent available value for each subnational area based on grant corruption perceptions. Again, a larger value means less corrupt. A lower value is more corrupt, so lower is yellow, brighter. Higher is darker, bluer. Yeah, so what I noticed, at least at first, was like, oh wow, okay, there's a lot of subnational variation in grant corruption perceptions, and even in countries that one might consider developed, high-income countries. People generally could be not so happy about their politicians and actually perceive things as very corrupt. Petty corruption, on the opposite side, looks more homogeneous. Also turns out to be much more homogeneous. However, here we have the issue that apparently petty corruption is so significantly extreme in the DRC, in the Congo Democratic Republic, that all the other countries or subnational areas are kind of pushed together in this normalization step where we make everything lie between 0 and 100, right? So in that sense, you have to not interpret things uniformly, but rather you have to look at these differences in their own context. Yeah? So in Congo, things seem to be so poorly arranged that other countries look better than they actually are. In terms of validation, the only reasonable thing that we can do, because there exists no other subnational index of corruption over time that has gone through this adjustment, like there's no holy grail, if you will. We compare our results at the national level to the World Bank Control of Corruption Index and the Corruption Perceptions Index of Transparency International, and find that at the national level, these things are quite correlated, about 0.82 for both. Yeah. Perceptions Index is expert-based. The World Bank Index is expert and household-based. We are, with this index, we're household-based. Yeah? And the Perceptions Index should be based on observations only past 2012. Yeah, that's when those observations are also comparable. And then perhaps this might interest you. The relationship, very simple relationship, not accounting for anything. So this includes national variation between petty and grant corruption. Here the correlation is about 0.42 to 0.48, depending on how you do it and whether you account for nonlinearities and such. So there seems to be some relationship there, but definitely they are different concepts. And we see that the indices of the World Bank and the Transparency International, if I recall correctly, they're a bit more closely connected to grant corruption rather than petty corruption, but they do capture both. Yeah, so our correlation is the strongest, I think 0.6 with grant or so, and 0.4 with petty, but 0.8 with the combination of the two, which is the subnational corruption index. Yeah, and so this is exactly why it's so valuable to separate these two concepts, because if you look at changes in the World Bank index or the Transparency International index, you're not sure whether people perceive things differently or whether fundamentally there is something that has changed.
Lamar, before we move forward, could we go back possibly for a couple of minutes back to the panel? Yeah, I guess panel B is good here. And the reason why I wanted to stay a couple of minutes is for both myself and everyone else here to be able to take this in, right? Because there's a lot of information packed very closely here, and I'm sure all of us are probably looking into our own countries and trying to figure out what that means, both for the different regions and in historical context. So, I have a question regarding methodology, and you'll notice that a lot of the questions are about that, and it's mostly because this is such an impressive work, and not just in general, which it is, but also, as you just mentioned, there are no other really well-developed databases at the subnational level, certainly not for this number of countries, right? So you actually don't have anything to compare to because you're breaking ground here, right? At the subnational level is also so important because, as you mentioned at the beginning, it very much affects or can guide policymaking. And one of the criticism that are usually thrown against the CPI and the World Bank Control of Corruption Index and others is that for advocacy purposes, in terms of comparing between countries, it serves a role, but in terms of deciding how to design anti-corruption measures, not so much, right? So I was wondering now, in the previous discussion, in the previous conversation we were having, we're looking at the management of these outliers, especially that they may be complicated when there's not a large sample size and how to deal with them, right? But you made the point that those were at a country year level, right? So I'm curious now at the subnational level. And let me give you an example here, right? So I'm from Peru, and Peru, well, we have, I believe, 25 regions right now. We're over 30 million people. The standard sample size for a regular survey of Peru is like most in other countries, over 1,000 or 1,100. The issue, however, is that there's a high level of centralization. So that potentially for a number of regions within the country, we have a really small group of people answering surveys, right? So it can be a dozen people or 2 dozen people. So my question is, how does this affect the production of results? Was this controlled for, managed in any way? If you can give some lights about that, that would be very valuable.
Thanks. Yeah, no, essentially what you do is within a country, you compare whether one subnational area is very different from the other subnational areas without taking into account centralization, decentralization. I feel that, if that is something that might be impacting how people perceive or even experience corruption, then this would be an interesting research question, and you wouldn't want to account for these things beforehand, right? So that these things actually vary depending on decentralization measures, say in a regression analysis or so.
I mean, my point about centralization was not so much about controlling for it as a control variable, but in the sense that when we are establishing a sample size for a survey, right? And this is the problem, I guess, with having countries as a unit of analysis, is that 1,100 people make sense for our number of millions of people you have in the country. But if you have a region, right, with, I don't know, 1 million people, 1.5 million people, or whatever number it is, but you only have 20 people answering the survey, then you're not getting a clear image of that problem, right?
Yeah. No, certainly, yeah. So what we do is then we don't explicitly say, hey, you only have 20 observations, so we're doing something to you. What we do notice is that regions, subnational areas with 20 observations are much more likely to be extreme. So we limit these extremities based on this relationship with the number of observations. But we don't concretely say punish regions because they have a certain number of observations. So yes, if you have a value in a certain subnational area and it is based on a small number of observations, but this outcome is in line compared to other regions and in line with your own data historically, we keep it. So we don't explicitly adjust for these things. However, I do have to say that we use, if available, survey weights in the barometers. Hopefully that does make things more representative, but no, you never know.
Right. No, thank you. That certainly gives a lot of insight about the decision-making process during the methodology stage of the work. And
so
I ask
if you
this
disagree,
because I get that the knee-jerk reaction or decision for many researchers would be just to drop all regions that don't reach certain number of data points, right? But you make certainly a valid point in terms of exploring the distance, right? The difference between that region and others, or that subnational administrative unit compared to others in the country to see if it's really an outlier or not. So I certainly see the point of that. Thank you.
We also don't feel that it is our place just yet to say, hey, this value is meaningless. Yeah? However, we do allow you to see the number of respondents for each subnational area. So if you have your own methodology or ideas about when things are representative across different fields or so, you have full freedom to adjust for that. So we have allowed for that and taken the more liberal stance of keeping everything in as much as possible.
Perfect. Thank you.
Good. Okay. So how do we get to the data? So if you've become interested and you would like to know how to work with this stuff, essentially the only like the original version of the data set is available at Figshare, which is like the default option for the journal where you share the data. Quickly check. Yeah, okay. And what you will find on that page when you click on this button on the right, this data set subnational corruption database, what you'll find is these files in the middle. And you'll see we will have the baseline data set, we have the comprehensive data set, and we have the sub-CPI, sub-CCI data set. And I'll just quickly go through each one of them. We offer them in Excel, Stata, and SPSS format, which should allow you to easily convert it to whatever format you prefer. Let's see. Good. So the baseline data set gives you values specifically in those years where we actually have sources available. Okay, so other than the imputation and the combining of questions, no other tricks, let's say. These variables are the SCI, the grant, and the petty indices. Now, for instance, for Afghanistan here in 2019, you see that we have values for grant corruption perceptions, but not for petty corruption experiences in this case. What we then do is we exploit this relationship between petty and grant corruption that I've shown you before. And within the country context, we apply the connection between grant and petty corruption, if possible. And in that way, fill in the value for petty corruption such that we can get to a subnational corruption index, okay? We only do that to be able to later on use this information to also get a longer series. However, from a research perspective, if you are interested in really pure changes, you should go with the core indices, SCI, grant, and petty, not the estimated ones, SCI2, grant 2, and petty 2. Yeah? And so it looks like this. You have all these values available, you see the source, and you see that, for instance, the grant index in the central area of Afghanistan in 2019, it has a value of 45.5, and this is based on 3,481 respondents for this particular subnational area. Interestingly, the worst countries tend to have the best data in this kind of research. It's actually the countries like Norway that are impossible to find if you are looking at corruption barometers.
Lamar, can I ask you something about this? And anyone else, please also feel free to participate as well, because I'm sure that you have right now many ideas about the presentation. So my question relates to this decision right here. I mean, it's not a decision; it's a solution to a real problem, and I really like this because very often I'm sure many of my colleagues as well, we're trying to figure out how we can maximize the data or the result that we get from this data by resolving these little problems in the data set, right? So what you're saying is that when you have a dimension missing or data for a dimension missing, correct?
No, when one of the two corruption types is missing.
So either the grant or the petty.
Or petty. Yeah, that's where we are.
Okay.
So we have already imputed all the dimensions, right? However, it could be that in some case you have not a single dimension for petty corruption, which is the case for this source. And then this value will remain missing for petty. And again, these indices were developed independently, so as a result, petty will be missing.
Okay. All right. Yeah. That's.
We could have alternatively also imputed all the dimensions for petty with the grant corruption dimensions. We would have a value, but then you wouldn't be able to distinguish anymore between experiences and perceptions where this imputation occurred. This is what we wanted to avoid.
So let me ask you. So what you're doing is using, for example, if you're missing grant corruption data, you're missing the data that you have for petty corruption, you transform it based on these connections that you identify or that we can identify between grant corruption and petty corruption in other countries, correct?
Yeah, so if you are adamant about having a subnational corruption index value, even if there is no information on petty corruption, then we will estimate for you petty corruption in a simple way, which is the basic relationship between the two within the country. That will give you the index.
Question there. So how do you establish the parameters for this relation? Is that based on the results of other countries in the region, or?
So what you do is you have these very simple regression equations here. Yeah, it's extremely simple. We've tried to not complicate things here. And again, for anyone that thinks they have a better way to estimate, say, petty corruption, then you can do so. Yeah, we just want to highlight that these data are not real in a sense. Yeah, so that people focus on this without pushing papers immediately. What you do is you have a regression analysis between the two, and you throw in country dummies. And if you have no other observations for the country, then the relationship between grant and petty will automatically default to the general one. That's how it works then.
And the general one, you mean then for the entire...
For the whole sample.
Right.
If you have multiple, if you do have surveys somewhere, say for Afghanistan region 101, that do have grant and petty, then this connection will be based on that relationship specific to that area or to that country.
Right. I was just wondering if you wouldn't make or how different would be the result if that default would be established based on the regression results for the specific region to which the country belongs. So, for example, if we're talking about that we don't have results for Nigeria, then it would be the regression result for other country or for the entire African continent, or at least that specific region of the world, instead of having it for the entire world.
Yes, you could do that. Yeah. So in this data, this is not what happened. Okay. So whenever if you're going to work with this, know that if there's no other data, then the relationship is sample-wide. if there is
Thank
other
you.
data
Sorry,
that's country.
Yeah.
relating with that, did you use dummies for the regions and for the years and for
Yeah,
the
so
countries, right?
you use dummies for the countries, which means you automatically use for the regions.
Yeah, yeah.
But you could
I think
take
that
it a step
because of
further and
that,
apply the region
yeah,
one.
I think that because of that, this question of Joseph can be integrated into these regulations. So it's not necessary to separate the samples because you are using the dummies for per country. So this is integrated in the regulation. So yeah,
No,
okay.
exactly. But what I think Joseph hypothesizes at least that different regions or different continents may observe different relationships between Grand and Paddy. And that even if you don't have other data for Afghanistan, you could apply this continent-specific Grand and Paddy relationship still to Afghanistan. And just to clarify, that is not what is happening here.
Thank you. Yeah, and I know that I and Joanna maybe also, but certainly myself, I'm going very much into the details of this, and the reason is because something that also we discussed in general in the community is the degree of transparency about the methodology that goes behind, and not only the methodology itself in terms of the formulas and the technical points, but the rationale behind those decisions. Because we appreciate that a lot of these requires a significant amount of time of thinking about it, how to resolve these problems. And it's not every day that we have the opportunity to ask the authors of this paper how they ended up making that decision instead of going in a different direction. So please bear with me. This is certainly not a point of criticism. It is just that I find brilliant this work and I want to know more about it.
Of course, yeah, no worries. Answering them is also very unique and very fun. It's not every time that people read what you write. Yeah. So, that much is clear then, I suppose. So what you see here is then the baseline data only available on specific sources at the subnational level and as well at the country level. If values are missing for one of the two types of corruption, petty and grand, we will estimate it for you with some model. You can do it yourself in another way as well. And that allows you to get a corruption index in each year, a subnational corruption index in each year, if you really need that. Then the comprehensive data set makes things more descriptive. Yeah? So we can end up with a value for almost every subnational area for every single year. To what extent you trust those values, it's up to you. So what we do is within years, yeah, so say you have values for 2010 and 2020, within you will interpolate, just simple linear interpolation, nothing fancy. We do that based on this estimated SCI, that is SCI2, okay? So here we do use this petty grand connection. And we interpolate this SCI2, and then instead of using internal trends and extrapolating them, we rather focus on something that we do know, and that is, at least at the country level, how did corruption change based on the World Bank? Why the World Bank? Transparency International can only be used from 2012 onwards. So the World Bank range allows us to at least do the whole 95 and 2022 setup. So extrapolated values are not based on internal trends, rather they're based on changes that are observed as per the sources of the World Bank, and in that sense, perhaps more trustworthy. But what it does mean, because the World Bank is at the national level, it means that we hold constant subnational variation once we start extrapolating, right? So all areas get about the same extra value. So in this way, we get an SCI value for every single year, for every single subnational area, which descriptively allows you to compare everyone in a given year, for instance. Yeah, that's the best value that we can come up with in a given year for that area. For instance, it might be unfair to compare one country in 22 to the other in 2006, when there has been so much time in which changes might have happened. So we try to track those changes as well as possible using interpolation and this World Bank trend. And we can only do this for the SCI because we didn't find a comparable grant and petty corruption index to extrapolate from. However, again, you have all the data available to you. So if you would like to somehow do descriptive analysis with petty and grant corruption, you could extrapolate based on internal trends, right? You are free to do so. Just that we don't offer that in this specific setup. And then lastly, if you have a tough time selling to your supervisor or to yourself or whatnot, using this random subnational corruption index built by these two random people that nobody ever heard of, well, then we also have estimated subnational versions of the corruption perceptions index, again from 2012, and the control of corruption index from the World Bank. So based on this comprehensive SCI, you can make a national level link with the World Bank and the Transparency International indices, which we saw before in the validation, that those are quite connected with each other. Based on that regression analysis, you can simply translate as per a formula the subnational values of the SCI to those of the Control of Corruption Index and the Corruption Perceptions Index. So that's what you see here. So our best guess, at least in how we have done it at the moment, is that in the central Afghanistan region in 2022, the CCI was minus 1.2 and the CPI was 23.5, which is then, say, 0.5 less than the country level value that we got in that year. Good. So those are the 3 data sets that you can download easily from that Figshare website, which is the data sharing platform of Nature Scientific Data. Additionally, we have collaborated with the Global Data Lab. Jeroen Smits, by the way, is the founder of that data lab. And what that allows you to do is quite interesting, I think. You can almost immediately link our subnational corruption data with other interesting subnational measures like CO2 emissions from the geospatial data or like the Human Development Index and its components at the subnational level. Or what I always like the most is this area database. We have so many subnational indicators. We have ensured when we were combining all the barometers that the subnational classifications of the corruption database were consistent between time and as close as possible to the classifications in the Global Data Lab databases, such that this integration would be the best. Because a subnational corruption index is very interesting, but a subnational corruption index that can easily be compared to many indicators is 100 times more interesting, of course, because you can immediately delve into the specific relationships here. For instance, one thing I find is that at the national level, material well-being is very connected with corruption, but within countries, it's actually not so much. So it seems to be that this is mostly a national institutional phenomenon, right? That's just one example. And there are many more things that you could do, and you're very invited to check this out. So how the database looks on this website is kind of like this. So here you have, again, the comprehensive, the baseline, and the subnational versions. So the CPI and CCI, the World Bank and Transparency International indices, you can only get on that other website. And then it looks like this. And you will be able to easily combine things with the Global Data Lab data. Additionally, we don't have shapefiles of our own, but the Global Data Lab does have shapefiles, and using this match of the regions between the two databases, you can create whatever geographical classification you would like for your own maps, which we saw some days ago done on LinkedIn. I forgot his name, for Mexico specifically. So that's very nice to see that that's already being used. So then finally, we are having some fun trying to create this corruption radar thingy, where on corruptionradar.org, we would like to throw together as much information as possible. So if researchers start working with this data, we would like to highlight it on this website. We would like to share it to people. At the same time, if there is an update for the database, we would like to offer it there first on that particular website. And you can also find the combine the regional key, say, for the Global Data Lab and the subnational corruption database. And well, thanks a lot for listening. And hey, if you are interested in the future, please go to LinkedIn as well and follow the page so that we can inform you accordingly. So thanks a lot. I found it very nice to talk about this for such a long time.
Thank you so much, Lamar. This is quite excellent. We still have a few minutes. If anybody would like to ask or comment something, could you stop sharing perhaps so that we can all see each other? So I have already mentioned on behalf of many others in the community just how impressive this work is, not just because of the amount of work that went into it, but because it feels it feels an obvious gap. Again, this is the kind of thing that we have been asking or thinking about for years, and nobody had actually come up with a solution to it. As you mentioned, when was it? A couple of days ago, Alfredo Hernandez Sanchez, who is a colleague of us, actually, we saw him in Dublin last week. He already applied this data set to explore corruption levels across subnational divisions in Mexico, right? So I mentioned this because I expect that people will almost immediately start running their own analysis and start working on their own papers based on this database, right? We saw this happening back in the 1990s with the CPI. When it first arrived, it was kind of like a one of a kind, and it spurred an entire generation of research using measurement of corruption. Of course, at the country level. So now I do expect that many studies will start looking into the question, but at the subnational level. So having the opportunity to talk about, so having you walk us through the methodology and what it means about the decision that went into it and how to interpret those numbers that we have in the file are very, very useful. So thank you so much about that. I do have a couple of questions, both about the past and the future. And again, if anybody else would like to jump in, please, you're more than welcome. The first one is a rather obvious one. Collecting data, even if it's just identifying the files and the sources, all of that is very manual, labor-intensive work to a degree. And then there's the process of cleaning it, putting in order, the whole thing. So I was wondering if you did this on your own. So if you can comment a little bit about that process. And my second question is about, you mentioned, I mean, you're an economist. I mean, for anti-corruption studies, it's not really a discipline. We are an interdisciplinary field. So I'm political scientist. We have a statistician, economists, anthropologists, you name it, mathematicians. So I was also wondering if you expect to continue working on corruption, specifically building on this project in the future or not.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah, of course. Well, we started this in 2020. So that kind of shows that the team was small. Jeroen and I did it together. And at the very beginning, we had access to one student assistant for about, say, 8 hours per week, I think, for about half a year. The rest we did ourselves. And so in a sense, that's also helpful, I think, because allowed us to properly see these patterns, come up with the idea of dimensions, the need for imputation and adjustments within dimensions. So yeah, we did it ourselves. So if there's any mistakes, you can get mad at us, and we cannot blame some magical invisible co-author or student assistant. Well, working on corruption, we have released subnational data. We are currently working on several projects. Of course, the goal now is to somehow get the index out there, also academically speaking, right? That people see that you can do some things with this. So we're looking at just descriptively to see what is the variation within countries, between countries, for the different types of indices. We think people could be interested in that. We are trying to build also one larger database at the individual level that then includes not only corruption, but the standard indicators like variables like gender, in which area you live, what age you are, to observe whether perhaps different type of people have different experiences with corruption. I'm for my dissertation, I also had a chapter on the relationship between petty corruption at the subnational level, and economic growth at the subnational level than in the low and middle income countries. So there's many directions that you could go, and there's more ideas than time. So, and of course, if any of you or anyone is interested in working with this data, like, we are very happy to take any questions or issues that you might run into. And at the same time, if you don't have any issues, if you're a very, very intelligent person, which I'm sure you all are, then we'd also love to hear what kind of stuff you're working on if you do decide to work with this data, so that we can know about that too, and maybe not end up doing many things at the same time.
Thank you, Andrew. Andrew, and then Fabiano.
Lamar, thanks very much. That was great. It was great to listen to. Just on the question of application, so I'm very keen on using subnational risk data, but I'd like to run past the problem that we're facing. So what we're trying to do is look at the level and costs of corruption at the different levels of government. So that there's general government, which is equivalent to your national level. The central government, which is the central government, and then you've got your subnational governments. So at the moment, just looking at your data, we could theoretically use them as parameters, which would give the difference between what's happening at the national and subnational. But it's a little bit different when we're looking at fiscal flows. Subnational is a plus, central government equals your national figure, your general government. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts of what are the ways you would approach separating out the corruption risk at the subnational level versus the central government versus the national or general government level, if that makes any sense. Because it's different because you're looking at risk, and when we start to look at losses and costs and inefficiency, we look at how much government spends at the different levels. So your national is a function of central plus subnational.
Yeah, and then the research question is, if I understand correctly, if there's a different relationship between subnational institutions and fiscal risks and
well, it's a bit of a question. So maybe step back a bit. What we do is we cost the losses at the we have the risk and we cost the losses at the general government level, but we have subnational revenue and expenditure data and balance sheet data as well off the IMF GFS database, and we can, or the modeling automatically assesses how much is being lost at the subnational level in aggregate. So you have subnational, which are all states, but it's a different way of looking at it because the spends are at different levels of government, whereas you're at regionals. You've got states, then add the states up, but that's your government. Whereas we're a bit different. So we're trying to get a parameter that can take that national risk and split it into
you're saying
subnational.
Like the national level deficit is different from the aggregate of the subnational deficit.
Yeah.
Like they have their own budgets.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean there are ways to specifically look at say corruption of that government level. It's not in the database, but we could discuss that. So if you remember the figure with all the dimensions, then for the grand corruption dimension, we had one specific for local governance. So indeed, actually, it's a good point that you are making, is that we have subnational values for corruption, but that doesn't conceptually necessarily mean that this is specific to that subnational government. Yeah, it's simply
just the
perceptions
state
and experiences exactly of those people in that area. This is an interesting distinction to make that I thank you for. But the local governance dimension would be specific to what you are looking at, probably.
Yeah. We'll be working on it. I think
it's
we're
not
going to come
available
up
for everything.
I think we'll
So-
be using your data sets to come up with something just to be able to have at the moment we do it with the same risk. So we're playing the same risk to central to subnational. But I think as we start exploring your data, we will be able to come up with a parameter that will give us a different defendable number that will differentiate between national and subnational, or central and central government and subnational. It looks really interesting.
I think you can safely assume that subnational differences are at least to a substantial degree also determined by the local government in that sense. And if you see some interesting things, then please reach out, and I will look together with you whether there is some more specific dimension that you might be able to use.
It might be more useful. Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Lamar.
Lamar, do you think we can still spare you for a couple of more minutes to have Fabiano's question?
Of course.
Fabiano, please.
Yeah, no, actually, not a question per se, just a few comments. We are just some kilometers away from each other. I'm here in Lugano in Ticino. So here
nicer.
we have a research group on public integrity here. And one of the research projects we've been conducting, and my colleague Julia presented here at the Roundtable a few months ago, was about the quality of anti-corruption surveys. So she came up with a sort of a ranking that based on, I mean, there's a huge methodological chapter. The quality of the surveys, which are the sources of your data. So perhaps just to share that. Perhaps in a future version, I don't know, you could calibrate the data based on the quality of the survey. I don't know, just one.
Oh, that's great.
Thing
So what kind of factors are the quality indices based on then? Is it like only sample size or also?
Also on the sample size, but also on the content, or what they cover, and so I think that could be useful for you. And secondly,
if you have the time,
yep.
Sorry to interrupt, but if you have the time, it would be great if you could send that, and we can easily see whether there are like huge differences for different quality sources based on this quality in it.
Yeah, no, sure. Yeah, that's something we should definitely do. So let's set up a call in the coming weeks. So we will be happy to share with you, and just to say congratulations. I think as Joseph said, it's really a groundbreaking work. There's an important critic about the corruption research area in focusing too exaggerately at the national level. So I myself did my PhD in studying subnational municipality in my case. So nice. That's something very impressive work. Congratulations, and let's talk soon.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, it's nice to hear all these compliments. I'm not used to this. Also to everyone in the chat, yeah, I've read your messages. I'm very grateful to hear.
I also just want to add, because everybody forgot to introduce themselves. Fabiano was associated with Transparency International Brazil for a number of years. So he has a long industry as a practitioner as well. Andrew Lang, of course, for a number of years. Right now, he's doing his PhD in Dublin City University, though. But again, a wealth of real-world experience. Giovanni is a postdoc researcher in the University of Bucaramanga in Colombia. And Fawad Darwish is a public official in Egypt. He was associated with the Administrative Control Authority for a number of years as well. Fawad, where are you now?
I just have a new post. I'm the head of the research center in the National Anti-Corruption Academy in Egypt.
Right.
Congratulations, Fawad.
And we just started to get a reviewed scientific paper about governance and anti-corruption. And I will soon share the link for our colleagues to have them publish with us. And it will be a big step for us.
Sounds excellent. Thank you. So yeah, just wanted to add that, Lamar, so you have a little bit of context of everybody here. I do hope that you continue working on this topic so that I can, I welcome you to the community, but I would love to see you continue interacting with it. And yeah, again, on behalf of everyone, you already heard, congratulations. It was an amazing work for you and Jeroen, of course. And yeah, lovely presentation. Thank you so much for taking the time today. and I hope to hear as news as you continue progressing in this line of inquiry, of course.
Make sure to follow the LinkedIn page then. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you.